historically high inflation.
In 2022, much of the world experienced a period of uncommonly high inflation, with the US, UK, and Eurozone all peaking at around 10%, meaning that prices on average were a full 10% higher than 1 year before. Though that's probably not a surprise to anyone watching this. It's thankfully now closer to the normal range.
It's more accurate to say that the basket of goods measured by the CPI statistic has increased by that amount. Prices broadly refers to a lot of things which are not calculated in the CPI basket. The price of capital goods, wages, these are all prices, but what the consumer price index measures is prices paid by the average consumer, or that's what it attempts to measure.
If still a bit high. But infuriatingly, since this chart just shows a rate of change, that doesn't mean that prices are down, just that they've stopped climbing as fast. And that really sucks. Consumers are stressed, businesses are suffering, and governments are scrambling. But at the same time, if you were to, find yourself reading and watching a ton of inflation-related content, you'll also keep hearing this.
A little inflation is a good thing?
A little inflation is a good
A
thing?
little inflation now would be a good thing.
No, a little inflation is not a good thing. I strongly disagree. In fact, there is no need to increase the money supply. The best monetary policy is to keep the money supply fixed, and any inflation is a bad thing. Any inflation has negative side effects.
Everybody wants a little inflation.
Why? If rising prices hurt seemingly everyone, why can't they just stay the same? Why can't inflation be zero?
Actually, a point of clarification: even if the CPI or increase in the CPI was zero, even if prices were stable, there could still be and would probably still be inflation. So, inflation, at least the way I define it, is an increase in the price level brought upon by an increase in the money supply. So, if the money supply were stable, you would expect to see prices falling as total production increased year on year. And this was the case, for example, in the post-Civil War era in America. Therefore, if the price level was at zero, not falling, then you would expect some of that to be because of inflation.
The first reason inflation can't stay at zero is because governments and their central banks don't want it to.
That's actually basically all the reasons.
Lots of countries actively pursue what is called an inflation target.
In the US right now, it's about 2%. In fact, that's the number that's used by most central banks across the world. But the truth of it is, that's a pretty arbitrary number.
The goal is what economists consider a virtuous cycle. Here's what that looks like. In times when prices are generally rising, people tend to expect them to rise further. And that actually encourages people to spend money now on big, durable purchases like cars or appliances in order to avoid having to pay more for the same thing later. And the stuff we need to buy no matter what, goods like food or clothing, gets more expensive too, which requires us to spend more. Either way, companies make more money, which means more people have jobs and more of their own money to spend.
So this whole spending theory of economic growth is incorrect. Actual long-term economic growth comes from the exact opposite. Instead of spending money, people save that money, and it gets reinvested in the productive process and manifests in the form of additional capital. Capital meaning man-made factors of production, like a factory or a taxi cab or a farmer's hoe. it should be pretty obvious. You can't consume your way to a higher standard of living. Not that there's anything wrong with consumption per se. After all, that's the whole point of working, is so that you can consume, that you can have a house or an apartment, that you can have food and clothes. And it's not for me to tell other people whether they should consume or save. That's an individual decision based upon your own particular value scale and goals, your own ends. However, if we're talking about what makes a country richer, what builds the economy more, then the answer is savings. Builds the economy more than consumption. I mean, obviously, if you invest more in producing stuff for the future than rather consuming stuff to have it today, then you're going to be richer in the future. So really, this is a lot of post hoc rationalization for inflation. Now, the problem with money and inflation and people who think and write about money and inflation is that virtually anybody who does so is what's known as a monetary crank. That is, somebody who believes that printing more money or creating more money leads to the creation of more wealth. But it's not true. Wealth is physical objects need to be produced, and money is just a medium of exchange.
Therefore, higher prices. So the cycle continues. But this bit of the cycle is crucial to its virtue. It's okay if prices rise so long as wages rise too. You'll still be able to afford the same goods if your wages keep pace with inflation. Emphasis on...
Now, this is an important question. What conditions are necessary for rising wages, especially for wages rising really quickly? Because that's basically the goal. That's the holy grail as far as economics is concerned. Especially, rising wages for the working class or the poor members of society. And if you look back over, say, American economic history, you can notice a few periods when wages rose faster than virtually any period. And one of those time periods was in the post-Civil War era, which ironically, modern economists will tell you this was a time period of massive depression and recession. The whole thing was a recession, they say, and yet it was a time of unprecedented economic output growth. Wages were growing. The GDP was increasing faster than at any other time in the history, American economic history, and yet this is supposed to be one great long depression. So the necessary conditions for increasing wages are, A, you need no inflation. So, because you need people to save their money, and they're not going to save their money if there's expectations of inflation. So you need no inflation, very, very low inflation, and then you need, and this is sort of a byproduct of A, you need the formation of capital stock, which happens when you have savings. The savings gets channeled via investment into the formation of capital stock, and then you need technological development as well. So those are the three sort of magic conditions for rapidly increasing wages. That's what you need. So one of the big problems with inflation is that it discourages savings, and hence that's why you have this problem with wages.
The if. In the US, for 2 years, wage growth lagged behind inflation. That trend has reversed, starting in mid-2023.
wages, especially at the bottom, have kept up with inflation. In fact, in many cases, surpassed inflation. And that is a good thing. That also, we have to remember, wages in this country are rock bottom and have been for way, way too long, right? So wage growth rising, good. Are wages high enough? No.
And a disruption at any point in this loop can lead to the kind of high inflation we've experienced over the past few years, when supply chain interruptions created product shortages, and some companies artificially drove up prices to increase their profits, which, along with some other costs.
What does that even mean? They artificially drove up prices. Everybody wants to get the maximum they can for what they're selling, but it's not. No one unilaterally dictates the price. The price of a homogeneous good or service is determined by supply and demand. No, what happened was companies got scapegoated for all the money printing that the central bank was doing.
Effectively turned this virtuous cycle into a vicious one.
With Digital Credit Union, you'll get a world of financial possibilities.
Combat rising inflation. They usually shift things here by raising interest rates, which makes all borrowing, including credit cards and bank loans, more expensive.
So the way that central banks raise interest rates is by having the central bank sell government bonds. Technically, they could sell anything, any financial instrument, but generally, it's government bonds, any financial instrument that they had purchased. But generally, they just buy and sell government bonds.
Goes up, it becomes more expensive to make investments, to hire people, and that eventually slows the economy down.
That's what the US Federal Reserve did in 2022.
The reason why increased interest rates decrease inflation is quite simple. It's because they decrease the money supply, or at least slow down the rate of increase. I mean, you can directly see in this chart that the artificially low interest rates of the central bank going to 0% May 2020, led to very high inflation. And then it's only, 2 years later, May 2020, when the central bank starts to realize, hey, we've got an inflation problem, that they start raising interest rates very, very rapidly to bring down inflation. And actually, this time period here, with the interest rate rapidly rising to 5% over about a year, it looks like, maybe a year and a half, represented the first time that the total money supply in the United States declined. And it declined for basically all of 2023. This is completely unprecedented, basically, in 20th century U.S. Economic history, to have such a long period of decline in the money supply.
Inflation closer to that 2% target, while placing an even higher financial strain on families who may need to borrow just to make ends meet.
When the Fed uses interest rates to bring down inflation, what they're doing is tamping down that demand, right? They're telling people, you can't have a job. Let's put you out of work so that demand slows, that price growth slows.
The Fed raises interest rates to slow down spending across the economy, partly by signaling to markets that they're taking the problem seriously, which creates an expectation that inflation will fall. But we also have to talk about what happens when prices fall instead of rise. That's called deflation. And falling prices honestly sounds pretty good, but they can also introduce another kind of cycle, a deflationary spiral. When prices fall, consumers may hold off on making big purchases, hoping for even lower prices in the future, and the stuff we need costs less, so we just spend less in general. If people are spending less, companies make less. They start to cut costs. And ultimately, they lay off employees. Unemployed people spend less, and even the people who are employed might choose to save more to stave off financial loss.
So, a couple problems with this theory. The first being it's historically inaccurate. Aside from the deflation that accompanied economic recessions, this whole deflationary spiral hasn't happened. And even with the recessions, it's dubious. But like if you look at in the post-Civil War American economic history, there was long periods of healthy deflation, about 1 to 3% a year, and this was a period of economic growth unprecedented, unparalleled in American economic history before or after. The other thing is the sort of deflation you expect or you would see with a stable money supply is only about 1 to 3% per year. So the idea that this would lead to massive changes in consumer habits is a little fanciful. You would expect to see increased savings uh, simply because um, your money's not losing value every year, so there is more incentive to hang on to it. But savings aren't a bad thing. They're not something to be feared. They're in fact the very basis of economic growth in a capitalist economy, because the number one thing that determines production is the amount of capital in the economy, and savings is how you get more capital. That money gets invested, lent out to businesses, and they use it to buy machinery, to rent space, etc. So this whole deflation panic really lacks historical precedent. You did see deflation during the Great Depression, but it wasn't the deflation that caused the Great Depression. It was the Great Depression that caused the deflation. The approximate causes of the Great Depression were, for one, the monetary expansion that was enabled by the newly established Federal Reserve System on the part of private banks, creating credit out of thin air as opposed to from consumer savings and lending it to businesses. This led to a 50% or $20 billion increase in the total money supply in the United States, which was on a gold standard, but because of the cartelization of the banking system under the Federal Reserve, the gold standard didn't. It wasn't a hard gold standard that kept the money supply stable. Banks were still able to increase the money supply through lending banknotes to businesses. So this bank credit, this expansion of credit, caused an artificial boom, which was ultimately liquidated in the bust, the Great Depression, and then that coupled with the trade war brought upon by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which really devastated the agricultural sector, which was heavily export-based, and led to the collapse of world banks, and then the stage was set for the Great Depression. And part of the reason why you do or did often see, did as in prior to the 20th century, often see a decrease in the money supply during recessions is because recessions are caused by an increase in the money supply. They're caused by bank credit expansion. And so the culmination of that expansionary boom is the contraction and things getting back to normal. So if you just never have that bank credit expansion in the first place, if you just have a hard money system with a stable monetary supply, no inflation, then you don't have that boom-bust cycle to begin with.
So prices go down even further as demand goes down.
So ultimately, all of that adds up to slower economic growth as a whole.
Which is really hard to fix because governments don't have the same ability.
And again, the only time when there was widespread inflation had the highest levels of economic growth in American history. So this is just not historically accurate, and it's their theory crafting. It's completely made up. Basically, it's apologetics for inflation in the central banking system.
To respond to deflation as they do to inflation. Look at this chart again. The last time inflation dipped below 2% in spring of 2020, the US brought interest rates all the way down to 0.05%. And after bottoming out for a bit, that seemed to work. Inflation inched back up. But if inflation hadn't come back up, the government...
Okay, this is ridiculous. You can't tell anything on a scale of when you're talking about monetary policy on a scale of 5 years. That's ridiculous that you would even look at that.
Government would have had limited options. Their rates were already getting almost out zero. And then things could get dicey. Historically, periods of true deflation are pretty rare, but when they do happen, it seems that fixing them requires a pretty serious shock to the economy. The Great Depression was a deflationary spiral, solved only by the outbreak of World War II, when the government supercharged spending and employment.
That's not at all true either. So, one of the big problems with the Great Depression was that the government tried to keep wages up under the idea that if wages are up, then people have more money to spend. They'll sort of keep things going. The problem is that this led to widespread unemployment. And you have to ask yourself, if you have 20% unemployment, which was consistent basically throughout the first 9 years of FDR's term. Unemployment was at, 20, 15, 20, 25%. So, if you had a massive amount of, say, steel that just wasn't selling in the market, what would you say about that? You would say, well, the price is too high, right? That's like economics 101. You gotta go to the market clearing rate, where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, and then everything will sell. And if you can price your stuff above that market clearing rate if you want, that's your right. Your steel is special or something, but then you wouldn't expect it to sell. And that's the same thing with so if you have widespread unemployment, well, it must mean that wages are too high. And if you prevent them from coming down, then you're going to have widespread unemployment. So that's what was happening during the Great Depression. And then they, quote-unquote, solved the problem with World War II by conscripting everybody. So, sure, if you enslave all the unemployed people and send them off to war, you've solved the problem that you created in the first place, but you solved it through a horribly immoral solution when you could have just not caused the problem in the first place.
Japan is finally emerging from decades of chronic deflation, but that's thanks in no small part to the high inflation that most of the world battled over the last few years. You don't want to rely on those kinds of things. If inflation goes below zero, it is...
Well, I mean, what Japan shows is that this loose monetary policy is not a recipe for economic growth. They tried 0% interest rates, and they had anemic growth. So it's not, you don't get real growth from artificially low interest rates. What you get is the illusion of growth, and sometimes not even that.
It's hard to fix.
The cost of deflation is really high, and that's something that we want to avoid.
This is where inflation targets come in. Let's look at this chart again. These lines are pretty shaky because there are a lot of really complicated factors that affect inflation.
The macroeconomy is made up of the decisions of millions of people, of millions of businesses, the way those decisions interact. I mean, try thinking about how to map everything out, and it's mind-blowing, right?
Inflation will always fluctuate, even if it's just a little. And this is the last big reason why they don't want inflation to be 0%. If inflation sits here, that basic shakiness is constantly at risk of dropping down into the deflation zone, triggering the bad cycle. And the way to prevent that is to have it sit just a little bit higher. So,
A little inflation is usually a good thing.
yeah, that's annoying.
No, a little inflation is not a good thing. Although there is a reason why the central bank and the government are in favor of inflation is what is the largest debtor in any economy? It is the government. So inflation does benefit debtors, which sort of sounds like it's an okay thing until you realize who are the biggest debtors. It's corporations. It's people like Donald Trump. It's governments, because they can borrow the most. They have all the assets and whatnot that banks like to see when you're applying for a loan. It's not poor people who might be in like a tiny amount of consumer debt or something. But inflation is bad. You don't need to have inflation. Obviously, if you're struggling, if you're on a fixed income, then inflation makes things so much harder. Often, wage rates increase slower than prices, so that's obviously very difficult for consumers and poor people. Also, the prices don't increase evenly. There's something known as Cantillon effects, which means that as the new money enters the economy, the people who get to spend it first get to spend it at sort of the old pre-inflation level. People who get it last, they're left holding the bag. So prices of some things will go up, while prices of others may not, which can cause problems if something you need is going up very rapidly. Inflation penalizes thrift, it discourages savings, and conversely, it encourages debt. This is a big problem because savings is a very essential component of the economy. And if you look at, in Canada, for example, consumer savings have been decreasing extremely rapidly since at least the 80s, if not longer. And so there's also, it also impacts entrepreneurship. Now, instead of being an owner, you more aspire to be a manager or an employee. And this is coupled with regulatory barriers to entrepreneurship as well that are rampant in most first world countries. And perhaps most importantly is this whole system of central banking, fiat money, is what causes the business cycle. So why can't prices just stay the same? They can. Even a steady price level isn't what we should be aiming for. That was the problem during the 1920s. That was the mandate of the Federal Reserve at the time, was a stable price level. But a stable price level for consumers can mask a lot of economic distortion that's coming from credit expansion. So what you really want is a stable monetary supply, which actually would feature some modest, healthy deflation. 1 to 5% per year, something like that. Basically, you got to eliminate central banking, go back to a gold standard and a hard money gold standard too. Ideally with gold specie, with coins circulating.